The drought had lasted 3 months too long. Across the high plains of Wyoming, 1887 was proving to be one of the cruelest years in memory. The creek beds had dried to dusty scars across the land, and the once green pastures had withered to brittle yellow stalks that crumbled underfoot. For Mason Holcroft, a 32-year-old rancher who had settled in Johnson County 5 years prior, the situation was becoming desperate. Mason stood on the porch of his modest cabin, squinting against the harsh afternoon sun. His small herd of cattle, now reduced to 14 head, grazed listlessly on what little forage remained in the nearby field. The wind carried the fine dust that seemed to cover everything these days, working its way into clothes, food, and lungs with persistent determination. "Another day without rain," he muttered to himself, rubbing his calloused hand across 3 days' worth of stubble. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd been rationing his food for weeks now. The nearest town, Clearwater, was a full day's ride away, and he'd been putting off the journey until absolutely necessary. Inside his cabin, Mason took inventory of his remaining supplies: half a sack of coffee beans, a few strips of dried beef, a small pouch of salt, and a single loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago. The flour barrel held barely enough for one more loaf. His eyes lingered on the bread. He could make it last another day if he was careful. As he contemplated his dwindling supplies, a sound from outside caught his attention. It wasn't the familiar lowing of his cattle or the whistle of wind through the eaves. It was different, the creak of a wagon wheel and the soft whinny of a horse. Mason stepped outside to see a weathered wagon pulled by an equally weathered horse coming up the rutted path to his cabin. The driver was a man he recognized from Clearwater, Samuel Waite, a farmer who worked a small plot outside town. Beside him sat a woman Mason assumed was his wife, her face shaded by a bonnet. In the back of the wagon, a small girl, no more than 7 or 8, peered out with hollow eyes. "Holcroft," Samuel called out, his voice as dry as the land around them. "Hope we ain't intruding." Mason shook his head. "Not at all. What brings you out this way?" Samuel climbed down from the wagon, his movements slow with exhaustion. "Our farm's gone bust. Dust took everything. We're headed to my brother's place in Montana. Thought we'd make better time cutting through here, but we've been slowed down. Emma," he gestured to the woman, "she ain't been well, and our little Sarah hasn't eaten proper in 2 days." The girl in the back of the wagon looked at Mason with eyes too old for a young face. Something in that look cut through to a place deep within him, a place he thought had hardened over the years of solitary ranching life. "Come inside," Mason said. "Rest a spell." The family followed him into the cabin. Emma Waite collapsed onto a chair, her breathing labored, while Sarah stood close to her mother, one small hand clutching at her skirt. Mason poured coffee for the adults and set out his dried beef. He hesitated only briefly before reaching for the loaf of bread, his last, and placing it on the table. "Please," he said, nodding toward the food. "It ain't much, but you're welcome to it." Samuel's face flushed with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "We don't want to take your provisions, Holcroft." "I insist," Mason replied, his eyes moving to Sarah, who was staring at the bread with undisguised hunger. Emma nudged her daughter gently. "Go on, child." With permission granted, Sarah reached for the bread. Mason watched as she tore off a piece and bit into it, her eyes closing momentarily in relief. Something twisted in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. They shared the modest meal, the adults making conversation about the drought, the cattle prices, and the rumors of range wars brewing to the south. All the while, Mason kept finding his attention drawn to the little girl, who ate with slow, deliberate bites, as if savoring each morsel of what might be her last meal for some time. When it was time for the Waites to continue their journey, Mason insisted they take the remaining bread and dried beef. "I'm heading to town tomorrow anyway," he lied, knowing full well his own pantry was now empty. As the wagon disappeared down the dusty trail, Mason stood on his porch, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him despite his growling stomach. He'd go hungry tonight, but somehow he didn't mind. Darkness fell quickly over the Wyoming plains, bringing with it a chill that seeped through Mason's worn cotton shirt. The winds had picked up, carrying whispers of the coming autumn, though summer's heat still dominated the daylight hours. Inside his cabin, Mason stoked a small fire in his hearth, trying to ignore the persistent gnawing in his stomach. After the Waits had left, he'd spent the remainder of the afternoon checking on his cattle and reinforcing a section of fence that had begun to sag. Physical labor helped distract him from hunger, but now, in the quiet evening hours, there was nothing to do but feel it. Should have saved at least a heel of that bread, he muttered to himself, pouring the last of his coffee into a tin cup. But even as he said it, the image of Sarah's grateful eyes came back to him, and he knew he wouldn't have changed his decision. Mason had never been a sentimental man. Life had taught him early on that sentimentality was a luxury he couldn't afford. Orphaned at 12, he'd worked cattle drives across Texas and up through Colorado before saving enough to stake his own small claim here in Wyoming. He'd chosen this isolated spot deliberately, preferring the company of cattle and open skies to people. Yet something about that family had stirred memories long buried, of his own mother's thin face during the hard years, of going to bed with an empty stomach more nights than not, of the rare kindness of strangers that had sometimes made the difference between despair and hope. His reverie was interrupted by the sound of his cattle, unusually restless in their pen. Mason set down his coffee and reached for the rifle he kept by the door, a habit from years on the frontier where threats could come from rustlers, wolves, or desperate men. Outside, the night was clear, a half-moon casting silver light across his property. The cattle were clustered at one end of their enclosure, their movements agitated. Mason scanned the perimeter, his hand tight on his rifle. That's when he saw them, riders, moving slowly along the ridge to the north of his cabin. In the moonlight, he could make out the silhouettes of men on horseback, at least a dozen of them, forming a line along the horizon. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. In these parts, a group of riders appearing at night rarely meant anything good. Range wars had been escalating throughout the territory, with large cattle operations trying to drive out smaller ranchers like himself. Just last spring, 2 homesteaders east of Clearwater had been found shot dead, their cattle stolen. He stepped back toward the cabin, keeping to the shadows. From this distance, he couldn't make out the riders' faces or determine if they were armed, but their presence at this hour sent a clear enough message. They were watching his place. Inside, Mason quickly extinguished his lamp and positioned himself by the window where he could observe without being seen. The riders hadn't moved from the ridge. They sat their horses in an unervingly silent tableau, like sentinels. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still they remained. Mason's thoughts raced. He had little of value beyond his cattle, and those would be difficult to drive off in the dark. Perhaps they were just scouting, planning to return another night. Or maybe they were sending a warning, letting him know he was being watched. As the second hour of their vigil began, Mason's tension began to transform into a strange kind of anger. After years of working this land, building something from nothing with his own 2 hands, the idea that these men could threaten all he had with their mere presence ignited a defiance in him. "I won't be scared off my own land," he whispered fiercely, though there was no one to hear. Just as he was considering whether to step outside and confront them, a foolish notion, given the odds, movement caught his eye. The riders were finally leaving, filing away one by one over the ridge until the horizon was empty once more. Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but a sense of unease remained. Those men had come for a reason, and he doubted this would be the last he'd see of them. He kept his vigil by the window until dawn began to paint the eastern sky in pale hues of pink and gold. Only then did he allow himself to slump into a chair, rifle still cradled in his arms, his hunger forgotten in the face of this new concern. Something was brewing in Johnson County, and somehow, Mason had found himself in the middle of it. The next morning dawned with a sky of burnished copper, the sun rising through a haze of dust that never seemed to settle. Mason had managed only a few fitful hours of sleep, his mind replaying the image of those silent riders on the ridge. With first light, he checked his cattle, all present, though still unsettled, and then saddled his mare Sadie for the journey into Clearwater. He couldn't put off the trip any longer. His supplies were depleted, and now he needed information as much as provisions. Someone in town would know about the riders, or at least have heard rumors. The ride to Clearwater took most of the morning, the landscape unchanging in its dusty desolation. As he approached the small settlement, Mason noted how the drought had affected the surrounding farms. Fields that should have been green with corn or wheat lay barren, and the few cattle visible were thin-flanked and listless. Clearwater itself was little more than a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of houses. Mason tied Sadie to the hitching post outside Henderson's general store, patting her neck before heading inside. The store's interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took a moment for Mason's eyes to adjust. Elias Henderson, the proprietor, was helping a woman with a bolt of cloth. He nodded in acknowledgement of Mason's entrance, but continued his transaction. Mason took the opportunity to study the other customers. There was Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, examining spools of thread, young Jimmy Coulter, probably running an errand for his father, and a man Mason didn't recognize, dressed in the dark suit of a city dweller, looking out of place among the calico and denim of the locals. When Henderson finished with the woman, he approached Mason with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Holcroft, didn't expect to see you for another week or so." "Supplies ran lower than expected," Mason replied, not mentioning his encounter with the waits. "And I had some unexpected visitors last night. Thought you might know something about that." Henderson's smile faltered. "Visitors? Riders. About a dozen of them, watching my place from the ridge. Stayed for hours." The store had gone quiet. Mrs. Peterson was suddenly very interested in a tin of baking powder, though Mason could tell she was listening. The stranger in the suit had turned to face them directly, making no pretense about his interest in the conversation. "Could have been anyone," Henderson said, his voice carefully neutral. "Drifters, maybe." 12 men don't drift together," Mason countered. "Not in these parts." Before Henderson could respond, the door opened, admitting Sheriff Dawson. The lawman paused when he saw Mason, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "Holcroft," he acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you to town?" "Supplies," Mason answered, "and questions about some riders who paid me a visit last night." Dawson exchanged a look with Henderson that Mason couldn't interpret. "Let's talk about that over at my office," the sheriff suggested, though his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The stranger in the suit stepped forward. "I'd be interested in hearing about these riders as well, if you don't mind." "And you are?" Mason asked, measuring the man with his gaze. "Forrester. Edwin Forrester. I represent the Wyoming Stock Growers Association." He extended a hand, which Mason reluctantly shook. The name of the association explained the quality of the man's clothes. The WSGA represented the interests of the territory's largest cattle barons, men who owned tens of thousands of acres and herds numbering in the thousands. They had little love for small operators like Mason. "Mr. Forrester is here on association business," Sheriff Dawson explained, his discomfort evident. "Now about those riders." Mason followed the 2 men to the sheriff's office, a small building next to the saloon. Inside, Dawson closed the door firmly before taking a seat behind his desk. Forrester remained standing, positioning himself near the window where he could look out at the street. "I'll be direct, Holcroft," Dawson began. "There's been trouble brewing. The association has concerns about certain activities in the county." "What kind of activities?" Mason asked, though he was beginning to understand. Forrester turned from the window. "Rustling, Mr. Holcroft. Cattle theft. It's become a significant problem for our members." "And what does that have to do with riders watching my ranch?" Dawson cleared his throat. "The association has hired men to monitor the situation." "You mean gunmen?" Mason said flatly. "Detectives," Forrester corrected, his tone mild, "to observe and report suspicious activities." Mason felt a chill despite the officer's warmth. "And am I under suspicion, Sheriff?" The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. "I've never stolen a head of cattle in my life," Mason said, his voice low but intense. "Any man who says different is a liar." Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "No one's accusing you directly, Holcroft, but the association has concerns about small ranchers in general." "What the sheriff means," Forrester interjected smoothly. Is that economic pressures can drive honest men to desperate measures. With this drought, we understand that survival becomes complicated. Mason felt his jaw tighten. The implication was clear enough. The big cattle operations, with their deep wells and access to the best grazing lands, were weathering the drought far better than small ranchers like himself. In their minds, that made men like him potential thieves. I feed my cattle with my own hay and water from my own creek, Mason said. I don't need to steal. Forrester smiled thinly. I'm glad to hear it. Then you have nothing to worry about from our detectives. Except having armed men watching my property in the middle of the night, Mason countered. That sounds like intimidation to me, Sheriff. Last I checked, that wasn't legal, even in Johnson County. Dawson spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. The association has considerable influence with the territorial government, Mason. They've been granted certain allowances during this investigation. Mason understood the subtext. The cattle barons who controlled the WSGA also controlled most of the territory's politics. Small ranchers like himself had little recourse when the association decided to flex its power. So what happens now? Mason asked. Those men just keep watching my place. They'll move on if they don't see anything suspicious, Forrester assured him. The association simply wants to protect its members' interests. And what about my interests? Mason demanded. My right to live without being treated like a criminal. Before either man could respond, the door opened, and a young deputy stuck his head in. Sheriff, there's a situation at the saloon. Jenkins and Taylor are going at it again. Dawson sighed and rose from his chair. Duty calls. Holcroft, I'd advise you to keep your head down and go about your business. This will all blow over eventually. As the sheriff hurried out, Forrester lingered, studying Mason with calculating eyes. You know, he said once they were alone, the association is always looking to acquire promising land. If the pressures of ranching independently have become too much, I'm authorized to make fair offers. The true purpose of the night riders suddenly became clear. This wasn't just about rustling. It was about pushing small ranchers to sell. My land's not for sale, Mason said firmly. Forrester shrugged. Everyone has their price, Mr. Holcroft, especially when times get hard enough. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a business card, placing it on the sheriff's desk. When you reconsider, you can reach me through the association's office in Cheyenne. With that, he tipped his hat and left, leaving Mason alone with his anger and a growing sense of foreboding. Outside, Mason stood on the boardwalk, taking deep breaths to calm himself. The confrontation had only confirmed what many small ranchers had suspected. The WSGA was using the rustling investigations as cover for a land grab. Holcroft. The voice came from behind him. Mason turned to see Samuel Tucker, another small rancher whose property lay about 10 miles east of Mason's own. Tucker, Mason acknowledged with a nod. Didn't know you were in town. Tucker glanced around nervously before stepping closer. Heard you talking to Henderson about riders. They came to my place too, 3 nights ago. Did they do anything? Just watched. But the next morning, I found one of my steers dead, shot clean through the head. Tucker's voice dropped to a whisper. It was a message, Holcroft. They're trying to scare us off. Mason felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Have you told the sheriff? Tucker gave a bitter laugh. What's he gonna do? We both know who's pulling his strings. So what are you going to do? I'm selling, Tucker admitted, shame evident in his downcast eyes. Got 4 kids to think about. Can't risk what might happen if I stay. Mason wanted to argue, to tell Tucker he was playing right into the association's hands, but he couldn't blame the man. Not everyone could afford to take a stand on principle. What about you? Tucker asked. Mason thought of his small herd, of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, of the life he'd carved out of this harsh but beautiful land. I'm staying, he said firmly. This is my home. Tucker shook his head. You're braver than me, or maybe just more foolish. Either way, watch your back. Those riders don't just work for the association. They're Pinkerton men, hired guns. They won't stop at killing cattle if they're ordered to send a stronger message. With that ominous warning, Tucker clapped Mason on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Mason to contemplate just how dangerous his defiance might prove to be. Mason spent the remainder of the day in Clearwater, purchasing what meager supplies he could afford. The encounter with Forrester and Tucker's warning weighed heavily on his mind. As he loaded his purchases onto Sadie, he noticed several townspeople watching him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as if his confrontation with the WSGA representative had marked him somehow. He was securing the last bundle when a small voice called out, "Mister." Mason turned to see a girl standing nearby, Sarah Waite, the child he'd given his bread to. She looked better than she had the day before. Some color returned to her cheeks. "Hello there," he said, surprised. "I thought you folks were headed to Montana." "Mama got too sick to travel," Sarah explained. "The doctor said she needs to rest." Mason glanced around. "Where's your pa?" "Looking for work at the livery." She stepped closer, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Mama wanted me to give you this." She handed him the bundle. Mason unwrapped it to find a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. "Mama said it's to replace what you gave us," Sarah explained solemnly. "She baked it at Mrs. Peterson's house." Something tightened in Mason's chest. "That's mighty kind of her. Please tell her thank you." Sarah nodded, then added, "Pa says there's bad men watching people's ranches. Are they watching yours too?" News traveled fast in small communities. "Don't you worry about that," Mason told her gently. "Your pa's got more important things to think about, like getting your mama well." The girl studied him with those old eyes and a young face. "The men at the saloon said those riders work for rich men who want to take land from people like you and Pa. Is that so?" Mason said, surprised at the child's awareness. Sarah nodded seriously. "They said nobody can stop them 'cause they got money and guns." She paused, then added with surprising fierceness, "It's not fair." "No," Mason agreed softly. "It's not fair at all." After saying goodbye to Sarah, Mason began the long ride home, the fresh bread secured in his saddlebag, a small comfort against the troubles that awaited him. The sun was already low on the horizon by the time his cabin came into view, casting long shadows across the drought-hardened land. He approached cautiously, remembering the riders from the previous night. Everything seemed quiet, his cattle grazing peacefully in their enclosure. Perhaps the detectives had moved on to intimidate another rancher. Mason had just unsaddled Sadie when he noticed the first rider appearing on the ridge to the north, the same position they had taken the night before. Within minutes, more followed, until once again, a dozen men on horseback formed a silent line overlooking his property. This time, Mason didn't retreat to his cabin. Anger overrode caution as he walked to the edge of his property, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. A warning, not a threat. "This is private land," he called out, his voice carrying in the still evening air. "You're not welcome here." For a long moment, none of the riders responded. Then one man separated from the group, riding slowly down the slope toward Mason. As he drew closer, Mason recognized him, a Pinkerton detective named Reed, who had been involved in breaking up a miners' strike in Colorado years back. Mason had heard stories about the man's ruthlessness. Reed stopped his horse about 20 yards from where Mason stood. "Just doing our job, Holcroft," he called, his voice casual. "No law against sitting on a public ridge." "We both know what you're doing," Mason replied, "trying to scare me into selling to the association." Reed smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Smart man. So why not be smart all the way? Take their offer. This land isn't worth dying for." The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the dust that swirled in the breeze. "My answer's the same as it was in town," Mason said steadily. "This land's not for sale." Reed studied him for a long moment. "The association doesn't take no for an answer, Holcroft. One way or another, they'll get what they want." "Then they'll have to do their worst," Mason replied, surprised at the calm in his own voice. "Because I'm not leaving." Reed's expression hardened. With a curt nod, he turned his horse and rode back up to rejoin the others on the ridge. The message had been delivered and received. Lines had been drawn. As darkness fell, the riders remained in their vigil, forming a circle that seemed to close around Mason's small homestead. Inside his cabin, he placed the bread from Emma Wade on his table, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, human kindness could survive. Whatever came next, he would face it. This land, this life he'd built, was worth fighting for.